Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, what constraints, if any, does the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement place on the ability of the New Zealand Government to tighten the rules governing the sale of New Zealand land to overseas buyers?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, in a number of free trade agreements as well as the World Trade Organisation, New Zealand has committed to not change the classes of investments which are subject to screening under the Overseas Investment Act. This means we will be able to continue to screen investments in those existing classes set out in the legislation, significant business assets and sensitive land, including farmland. And Chinese investors are subject to the same rules as everyone else. In all our FTAs, New Zealand has preserved the ability to alter some of the criteria and factors against which proposed investments are assessed if that is deemed desirable by the government.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is it the case that rules governing the sale of land to overseas buyers from China and in force at the time of the signing of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement cannot be tightened without breaching the terms of the agreement?
The Honourable Bill English.
No, I don't think I would agree with the member. I mean, he's raised a quite legitimate issue, that is that if the government was to alter the Overseas Investment Act, then it needs to take account of the undertakings it's made in FTAs, but I don't believe that those undertakings prevent a tightening of the rules.
Dr. Russel Norman.
In the current review of overseas investment that the Minister has referred to previously, dealing with overseas investment in land in particular, has he considered the issues in relationship to free trade agreements and whether those free trade agreements place constraints on how we can change the overseas investment regulation?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, if the government was to make any change in the Overseas Investment Act, then yes, it would certainly be checking that against the free trade agreements. My impression is that those agreements don't prevent the government from altering to some extent the way that it screens incoming investment.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If the government were to decide that all sensitive land, as defined within the Overseas Investment Regulation, greater than 5 hectare farmland, for example, all sensitive land must remain within New Zealand ownership and couldn't be sold into overseas ownership, would that stay within the terms of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, certainly from the government's point of view, that's a hypothetical question because we wouldn't be considering the option of banning any overseas ownership of sensitive land. Sensitive land being a very broad category of land. It includes farmland, but it also includes quite small areas of land next to waterways, for instance, such as sections with commercial buildings on them.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How will his government constrain the ability of overseas investors from China to buy land in New Zealand without tightening the overseas investment rules and hence potentially breaching the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's unlikely. In fact, it's out of the question that the government would tighten criteria related to investors from one particular country. I don't think our FTAs or our commitment to the WTO would allow that, and in fact it wouldn't be sensible economically either. We need to keep in mind that any investor coming in to buy, say, farmland in New Zealand has to pass the existing tests in the Act, and those are tests that were laid down actually by the previous government when it rewrote the Overseas Investment Act. So any application that's in the pipeline now will be dealt with by the tests laid out in 2005, I think it was. And if there was to be any change in those tests, the government would signal that ahead of time.
Honourable David Parker.
What signal is his government sending to the world when he is on record as saying we need to relax rules on foreign investment, while John Key has been saying just the opposite? Or is this merely another example of the government belatedly agreeing with the Labour Party position, as they also seem to be doing on savings?
The Honourable Bill English.
No, Mr. Speaker, it's another example of the member's shallow analysis and political manipulation of statements. The government's review of the Overseas Investment Act. The government's review of the Overseas Investment Act was always aimed at reducing the time and cost and uncertainty of the decision-making process, and that continues to be an objective of the government. In fact, we've achieved quite a bit of reduction in the bureaucracy associated with that over the last 18 months.
Supplementary.
The Honourable David Parker.
When will the Minister release the long-awaited review into foreign investment, announced 17 months ago? Or is this just another example? Is this just another example of a government which has pulled itself into a standstill because it has no coherent plan?
The Honourable Bill English.
No, Mr. Speaker. It's an example of a government. It's an example of a government that's been so busy with its bold and wide-ranging plan that this matter of lower priority will appear when we're ready.